All right, guys, welcome to the podcast. Today, I put together something that's been intriguing me, and I've talked about and touched on in the past a little bit, sort of two topics. One thing I've always been fascinated by is mental health. I always loved my psych classes in college, and, I've been surrounded by a lot of people in my youth that have had addictions and, significant disorders. And I've always tried to be a good friend to them and understand what that's about. How does mental health work? How much of it's chemical? How much of it's behavioral? What's developed, and the concept of the addictive personality and the associated disorders. I've read loads of Freudian and Jungian research. I've always been drawn to further understanding of how the mind works, as well as my fascination with the body and, of course, the spine and nervous system. Today, I broke it down to a topic that two things that sort of intersect with each other. The concept of having three different brains in the body. You may have heard that everyone knows about the brain in your head. And the second one is really considered the enteric nervous system, or the gut. So the intestines and all the interplay they have with microbes. And the third, and they put it in different order, but I put it in order of number of neurons associated with them. The third would be the heart, and that the heart has its own brain. So when you look at getting healthy, it's multiple factors involved in that. I always talk about motion and water and breath and the physical, chemical, and the emotional aspects of health. Today, I want you to search into your mind a little bit and start thinking about where there are other centers of thought, other centers of belief, and higher cognition. And the concept of having three brains, you'll hear that there's four brains. There's people that have gone nuts with it. But to me, the three brain has the most validity, scientific validation. There's a fair amount of research and extrapolation, of course, on this stuff. But let's look at, the idea of sort of depression and its association with the three brains, what we can do with our three brains. Because depression is, with this pandemic and with the shifts in society lately, is completely out of hand. It's terrifying. So I want to make sure that I can do my part, at least, to spread some information and maybe get some answers. So right now, I thought this was interesting. 70% of our workforce is disengaged. So in other words, 70% of the people working aren't really engaged in their workplace. They don't feel like they're either putting all their energy into it, enjoying it, being a part of the team. Maybe they feel abused or taken advantage of in some way, or they're just plain bored, underpaid, whatever the case is. But, to think about 70% of this country will define themselves, if you help them with that simple definition of disengaged, as disengaged, as not part of being excited, or certainly not being their best at work. And you see a lot of different corporations that put classes together, and we have this concept of working as a team. And there's been a lot of effort put into that, obviously, but we're still dealing with 70% of the workforce disengaged, which I thought was incredible. And with that kind of disengagement, it's associated with depression and anxiety, which came first, chicken and egg kind of thing. But a lot of jobs, I think bosses out there, people who hire people, people who employ and train people, realize that you're probably dealing with a 70% disengagement. And, most healing comes from, to get out of jail, you got to know you're in jail. So I advise anybody to take a look at their employees that run businesses and maybe bring it up and you actually use the word and ask them if they feel engaged in the process, because there's sometimes very simple things you can do to re-engage people. Simply letting them know you care, I think, is a massive one. I think it's called the Hawthorne Effect, when they changed certain things in a workplace and everybody felt, production went up because people felt taken care of and cared for. I think that's important. But so let's look at, 1 in 10 adults ages 45 to 65 are depressed. They are usually female, twice as much as male. They tend to be divorced. The less educated and simply unemployed, the worse these conditions are. So the majority of those people have some of those factors involved. 11% of the population is using antidepressants right now. And the average person takes up to 10 years before they get any help. And right now, 80% of the people that are dealing with depression aren't getting any help at all. So we got a massive problem here. There's a 20% increase in the diagnosis of depression every year since 2007. So we have a massive growing problem here. 60% of the people that are getting help are being helped with meds and some type of talk therapy, psychotherapy, some type of psychological counseling. So 60% are being helped. So we got 40% that are not being helped very well by that same therapy. And you can imagine that's a large amount of people, to be roaming around. But let's take a look at what in each of the brains, maybe what can be done. So at first, there are physical findings. You can take brain spec images, which I think everybody should look into. Brain specs are really interesting images of the brain now that we can predict a lot of the different behaviors of people and diseases in people, like Alzheimer's and dementia, with the images of the brain. It picks up the sort of the neural activity of the brain, how much sort of firing there is. So you could actually diagnose from these before there was no sort of physical technology to diagnose depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's. It was symptom-based mainly. And what they found in these brain spec images in people that had depression were smaller frontal lobes. So this part of the brain was actually shrunken a little bit. And the hippocampus. The hippocampus is associated with a lot of emotions and the correlation between different parts of the brain to process emotion properly. So actual physical findings can be found in people that are depressed. So showing you how real it is, and that the ridiculous stigma that there's something so horrifying and strange about depression. I mean, with so many people dealing with it, it's obviously a very real thing. There are chemical findings. I've said before that serotonin, one of the main chemicals, the amount of serotonin in your blood will dictate your success and happiness almost exactly. And it's an amazing thing. Some people are born with a lot of serotonin. Other people just aren't born with much. And that could simply be that link of depression within families. But a lot of serotonin is made in the second brain, which we'll get to in a second. So if you're going to be able to make a chemical that makes you successful and happy, I think you should get right on it as soon as possible. So people that are depressed have low serotonin, low norepinephrine. They have low dopamine. Dopamine's another thing that makes people feel really good. And they tend to have high cortisol, the stress hormone, of course. Usually stress and burnout tends to lead to depression. Anxiety and lack of sleep leads to that as well. And low thyroid hormones. You think of how many thyroid disorders. I'm surrounded by people very recently that have had significant thyroid issues, and they're on medication now to help with that. But getting that balanced, or at least looking in that area to make so you're turning over every stone to find that out. But let's give natural answers. Okay, so the first brain has 86 billion neurons. So the brain in our head, 86 billion neurons. And if you look at the second brain, you could ask the question, do our intestines think? And the difference sort of between the mind and the brain, we'll get to in a second. The mind, just think of it as an all-encompassing series of processes that lead to our ability to sort of be conscious, where the brain is a little bit more mechanical than that, a little more neural function and that kind of thing. But within the intestine, in the second brain, there's a correlation between constipation and depression. And I thought that was interesting because if we're going to talk about proper bowel function and the second brain being in the intestine, when the intestine just slows down, in a sense, the brain slows down, the brain in our head, the first brain. So the second brain is feeding into the first brain in a neural way. We all know that if we don't absorb the right food, we can't feed our brain with the right nutrients, and that becomes another problem. And that 90% of the serotonin is made in the gut. There are these enterochromaffin cells. Now, an enterochromaffin cell it's in the intestine, and it has a link from the vagus nerve, one of our cranial nerves that runs all the way down into our intestines, one of the most important nerves in our body. It connects with that, and it connects to our food. So it links the sensation and the sense and the nutrient content of our food, creates an impulse, and then feeds the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve then feeds back to it. So the food, the vagus nerve, and this cell are all communicating with each other, and they stimulate a microbe in there to then produce serotonin. So if we're eating healthy foods, we're getting a proper amount of fiber to stimulate mechanically these cells. They want mechanical and physical chemical stimulation. We start producing higher levels of serotonin, get to the success, and the happiness starts to come out. So let's look at some foods that are good. It's going to be all the stuff the healthy foods for sure. But oysters, salmon, nuts, eggs, pineapple, and chocolate are all associated with increasing the production of serotonin in our bodies. These are all really pretty tasty foods, I think. So if microbes are making 60% of the signals to make serotonin, the other serotonin is made in the first brain. So we have a little bit of a situation where they're both working together. But the first brain serotonin making is a little tougher to create. That's, maybe meditation, truly getting yourself stimulated and having, a positive outlook, and that more stuff in that area. But when we're talking about the second brain, we're talking more of a physical situation. And so if the microbes are important, imagine that we have to eat probiotics and fermented foods, stuff we've touched on in other podcasts. So if we're going to have the right ratio of bacteria in our body, we're going to be able to produce the right stimulus to the endocrine cells, and we're going to be able to secrete and stimulate neurons that associated with the bacteria that will help us make the microbes that help us make serotonin. So we want to make sure that we're eating right. The interesting thing about the gut and the idea that it is its own brain is you can disconnect surgically the vagus nerve to the gut, one of the main nerves of the gut, and the gut continues to run. And the problem that they see is the gut then doesn't communicate with the first brain. So the vagus nerve is kind of the connection from the gut to the brain instead of the other way around as much as you'd think. And if you have so many cells down there, so many neurons in the second brain, you can imagine there's 100 million neurons in the second brain. There's, in a sense, it has a little self-control. It can, it conducts within itself as you would think of a brain working, being able to sort of run on its own and then be a master of its surrounding cells. So if the first brain is a master of most of the body, then we have other brains, the next two, that are also working by themselves in a sense to then conduct in other parts of the body. So if microbes are making 50% of the dopamine and 90% of your serotonin, right? So we said earlier the 60%, that's making the signals that make serotonin. But in the end, the microbes themselves, 50% of dopamine, which makes you feel fantastic, and 90% of your serotonin. So a mix of microbes is what's really important. Diversity. When they looked at farm kids versus city kids, farm kids were around a lot more microbes, dirt, filth, and they had a real nice big diversity. And that kind of diversity led to much more interplay and phytonutrient breakdown, as opposed to city kids, which had the same number of bacterium, but the diversity, they were all the same, or the majority of them were similar, let's put it that way. So they weren't able to take on the different challenges, stimulate the immune system. And that led to asthma in that study, but it also led to, lower cognitive skills. Test scores were lower, and there were a lot of immune system disorders in general, which would be associated, of course, with serotonin. So if your serotonin's low, you're going to have those same issues: depression, loss of energy. And how are we going to get the energy to make it through a tough day, study and get in and take a test and do well in it? If your serotonin's really low, you don't have that happy success axis type of thing going. They did a study where they took mice in an environment that didn't have any bacteria that would likely fluorinate their intestine. So they had a sort of a vacant second brain. At least a good part of the second brain didn't have its mechanisms without those bacterium in there. And they looked at the behavior of the mice, and they had behavior that was very similar to how we would define autism in humans. And everyone's looking for the reason why so many kids are autistic these days, and there's all sorts of theories on that. One can simply be that the second brain isn't actually activating and playing a good role in its communication back and forth with the first brain to help with such things as learning, cognitive skills, memory, short-term and long-term memory, and impulsive behavior, be able to control impulses. And when they put the bacteria back in these mice, that behavior went away. They became like more normal, and their behavior more similar to how humans behave. So I thought that was fascinating, that the microbes in that second brain were so powerful, and they were dictating what the first brain was able to do and performance-wise as far as like an autistic behavior. And you think about one of the things I really thought was near science fiction when I read it was how often there are studies put out that the bacteria you have in your intestine are dictated by the quality of your foods. So with high quality food, you're going to have a nice flora of bacteria that belong in there, and they're going to put out a chemistry that's going to basically make you happy and healthy. When that changes, say you start out at McDonald's and you're having the milkshakes and all that stuff, you're going to end up with a ratio shift of more pathological or parasitic bacterium, and most likely virome as well. And you'll end up then craving those foods to feed those bacteria. So the idea that a pathological bacteria sitting in your intestine can create a chemical that changes your behavior is amazing to me. So these bacteria, you think about it, how else would they stay alive if they didn't get us to eat what feeds them? It's absolutely amazing. So your intestines, the ratio shifts because of a poor diet. These bacterium start to grow, this pathological parasitic bacterium, hookworms, flukes. There's a bunch of different parasites that can live in your intestines, and you won't even know it. And you end up craving certain foods to then feed them at your detriment, which is basically how we look at a parasitic relationship, as opposed to a symbiotic relationship where everybody wins. In a parasitic relationship, you lose, the parasite wins. In other words, you're being damaged by its presence in your body, as opposed to the probiotic and friendly bacteria that are actually putting out a chemistry that actually assists you in digestion and in general health. So once again, that connection between the first brain and the intestine. So the third brain is the heart. Now in the heart, we have 39 million neurons. 40,000 of them communicate to the first brain. So there's a chunk of them, 40,000 of them, that has its own, in a sense, like a focal neural entity, like a brain inside the heart, that is conducting back and forth to our brain. So you think of in literature and in art, that Valentine's Day, the heart is considered the center of love. And you look at studies they found, especially there was one in Italy, where they looked at the correlation between longevity and social connection. And that when the person was living in a sense in a heartwarming environment, where the great grandparents and the grandparents and the great grandkids were all living somewhat in an area where they all could be with each other, maybe in the same house. There was longevity because there was a stimulus maybe to the heart energy, right? And there's an electromagnetic field around the heart that is the biggest one in the body. If you were to take sensitive meters and look at electromagnetic spectrum, the heart's carrying the biggest one. And at first they thought, well, that's just because it's beating. But when they looked at it, even when muscle was in a similar state, the electromagnetic state didn't match it. So it's as if the heart has this firing of neurons, not just for beating, like the muscle that it is, but it actually conducts to the first brain. And there's correlations also to the second brain. So all these brains, sort of work together. But the mind and the body communicate using peptides, and that's something we can get into on another level. But there are things released that they don't always, they can communicate neurally, like that 40,000, the heart's communicating with the first brain. They can also connect in a way that they are releasing certain chemicals. And a peptide is one of those chemicals that takes one brain and gives it a signal for another brain. And to think of these things running, in a sense, independently, but also interconnected, but to be able to look at them differently and be able to take care of them properly. So we don't end up with the amount of, sort of disconnect that leads to lower energy states that ends up leading to depression. It might be some of the reason you think of the foods people have been eating during the pandemic and people gaining weight during the pandemic. It's absolutely unbelievable that during a time when your weight has a lot to do with your survival of this virus, people are actually gaining weight. It's like the last thing you should be doing, but it's comfort foods. And if we had other ways of comforting ourselves besides food, we'd be a lot better off, right? So I want to look at, to sort of wrap this up a little bit, I want to take a look at the difference between the brain and the mind. Because, obviously those are confused. The brain is, can be just look like this slab of jello in your head. And you can look at all the neurons and it kind of just looks like really kind of a plain thing. It's not that exciting. When I've dissected the brain, it's really like cutting through a cottage cheese-like thing. There's certain differences and different parts of it you can see, but for what it does, you can't believe how mundane it is visually. It's really not anywhere near as exciting as other organs that you can dissect. But the mind is something that's so encompassing and so vast. And authors have given a lot of verbiage and definition to this, but I like this one. This is Dan Siegel, UCLA School of Medicine. He said the mind is the emergent self-organizing process. It's like a self-organizing process, both embodied and relational, that regulates energy and information flow within and among us. I'm going to read that one more time because I think it's so cool. The emergent self-organizing process, both embodied and relational, that regulates energy and information flow within and among us. Meaning that the mind goes outside of us in a sense, that our thoughts have an energy that may be manifesting outside of us, affecting others and affecting maybe material. And the idea of materializing thought's always been a really kind of far out science fiction cool thing. I've looked into aspects of quantum physics that can validate that our thoughts actually affect matter outside of us. But if we bring that way in and just say something simple as our thoughts affect the people around us, our thoughts affect the next thought we're going to have. And we can have this cavalcade of one idea leading to another. And we get off on a tangent. We go down the wormholes. A lot of people say now, especially people get online and go down wormholes of information. But we can do that in life as well. And that down spiraling type of thing, we need to trip that switch and switch over to something a little more positive. And that's why I think, affirmations are so important, especially when someone's dealing with this kind of thing. So the fact that our mind extends beyond our brain is really what I get across there. And that we have 3 brains. Each of them have a mass of neurology, and they are been researched to be able to communicate separately from each other, and that we should be taking care of each of these organs, eating properly, exercising, doing all the stuff that I preach on this. But at the same time, know that this is one of the ways of another way of looking at your body, because I like to talk about how there's an emotional, chemical, and physical aspect to being healthy. Anytime one of my patients can't figure out what's wrong with themselves, or I'm struggling with what might be a diagnosis for them, I always say, let's go back and review the emotional, chemical, and physical aspects of your life and see where is the stagnation within those that needs to be jump started and brought to another level. But in this one, we're looking at, the 3 brains within that system and how they intercommunicate, and the respect that you should have for each of them as separate entities that are obviously connected. But that is something that I want you to look into. So take a look at what we said today, review this. There'll be a PDF so you can look over it. Like I say, if you like these podcasts, give them a thumbs up, subscribe to the station. Also, we opened up a university, ChristopherUniversity.com. I have a class on there you can take. All the podcasts are on there. So check out all that stuff, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a good day.